to record. So, today we are continuing our journey through theological science in chapter 5 with the amazing Travis Stevick, whose name I'm trying to learn to say correctly. Did I get it right there?
Yes. I don't know if it's
Okay.
amazing. It's just I find myself just utterly fascinated by Torrance's epistemological work.
Yeah, well, that makes you amazing. So, we're going to go with that. So I'm going to begin with a word of prayer here, and then we'll dive in. We do thank you, our God, for all of the coming alive of spring, of Easter right behind us, and just aware of the delight that the disciples were having to find that you were alive. So may you live in our conversation today. May theological science not be directing away from you, but to better understand what it means to hear and know you as the living Lord of our lives. So bless us in this time. We also just remember Bryden as he's facing surgery and recovery and all those things that are needed of his body. So for the life that you give us and the sustaining of the ones we love, we pray your blessing. In your name we pray, you who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Uh, yeah, he should still be in ICU.
Still in ICU?
Well, I assume so.
Yeah,
He said he had his surgery our time Monday evening.
our time Monday.
Yeah.
What was the necessity for it?
He was sitting in the airport and he had a cardiac arrest.
Oh
He had
no.
three doctors revive him and get him to the hospital, but they said he was lucky that he made it through that.
Oh my.
So anyway, they're working on him. We're praying for Travis that his body will mend without the need of intervention. So we
Yeah,
have hearts and shoulders and all these things. And Travis is the youngest among us too. So I mean,
at least here, I think.
Can you type? Can you type, Travis? Can you
What's that?
type?
Yeah, yeah, I can
Okay.
type.
he
Oh
just
no, no,
can't lift his arm above.
no.
There's a
I'm basically. What's that? The reason I want to not have surgery more than just any other reason is because I've been told that it's not the kind of surgery that you should just put off indefinitely. If I need it, I can't. There's a long story about this, but I'm supposed to be playing with my wife and a friend of ours at Iowa Irish Fest at the beginning of August, and I would sure like to be able to play. And I probably will not be able to do so if I have to have surgery. But
Yes, well, someday we're gonna have you begin our session with a little bit of music when you're able to play. So a proper prelude to engaging theological science, with music.
all right,
So last time we met, we were with Paul Molnar and we looked at the logic of God
mm-hmm.
within this chapter on the problem of logic. So we're dealing with problems, and obviously there are problematic ways that people are illogical or get off logic or use wrong logic. And so today we're looking at the logic of man.
Okay.
So Travis has done up a 3-page outline for us that we'll walk through. And
Mine's
we
five
want
pages. I don't know.
Oh, is yours five? Oh, actually, yep. No, you're right. There's the backside of mine. So anyway, the nature of 5 pages of discussion to, at one level, distinguish that we have to hold the first section on the logic of God before we can get to the logic of man,
Mm-hmm.
or it becomes problematic.
Right.
So why don't you just go ahead and start by just give us a quick what is the difference from what Paul did last time with the logic of God and the logic of human, just to help us make the transition within the chapter?
Yeah, I mean, so the difficulty is, and I kind of alluded to this in my first page here, is that Western history has had a tendency to say, almost a start with logic. And so you've got, and Euclid looms largely over it. And we are in a situation now where we realize how short-sighted that is, but for literally thousands of years, it was, Euclid was not just true, but obviously self-evidently true. Just you wouldn't, anybody who questioned Euclid would be laughed at, because it is so rigorous and it is so airtight of a system. What you would get occasionally, so you have his first 5 postulates are, the first 4 of them are very straightforward. two things equal to the same thing are equal to each other, stuff of that nature. And but there's one, they're all very, very straightforward. But there's one of them that there's a bunch of different ways people have spun it in logically equivalent ways. And this is not the version that's in Euclid, but the version that's in my head is given a line and a point not on that line, there is exactly one line through that point that is parallel to the first line. And it's so much longer, it's so much more complicated that you did start having people say, maybe we could prove this from the other four. Maybe we can somehow show that it's not actually an independent axiom. And what we've determined since then is that actually it is definitely independent because it is not required by the first four. Because we have constructed geometries that are where there are no lines parallel to the first one through that external point, and we've constructed geometries where there is an infinite number of lines that are parallel to the first one. And not only that, we have come to conclude that almost certainly the universe taken as a whole, at least, is not Euclidean. And so it's one of those things where what started out as an interesting mathematical question of Euclid, which was already radical in itself, has not only been shown to be possible, but very much real. And what that has shown us, we live in an era now for the first time in literally thousands of years, in kind of the post-Einsteinian world, where we realize that Euclid cannot be taken for granted because we know it is literally not how the world works. And that makes us think about it differently than we otherwise would have. So to a certain degree, you could say before, well, Euclid is the interior logic of the world, of angles, of measures, and all the rest. And we realize that now we realize that only works on a relatively small scale, not on a cosmic scale for sure. And so the reason why it's really important, though, is that it used to be the case where you could challenge almost anything, but if you challenge Euclid, you should just give up because you're just clearly, obviously wrong. You'd be utterly foolish. And so the reason why it matters for us is because that history looms so largely in the background that for Torrance to come along and say, we have to let actuality tell us what logic is very counterintuitive, or at least there's a lot of inertia that we have to fight against, at least in the Western world, for that. And so now what I appreciate about Torrance, and what I've always liked about Torrance, and I always share with people, is that he's such a bold theologian, that he has the strength of his convictions in a way that not everybody does, where he says, if Jesus is the incarnate logos of God, that word logos is even the root of logic and rationality and things like that. And so when he starts off, it's not an accident that he puts the logic of God first, because if we don't understand how logic works in the being of God, we will be consistently trying to clamp an artificial framework on God. And so we look at this and we talk about how it's this inherent Trinitarian nature of God, that God makes sense because of who God is, Father, Son, Spirit. And so any external framework we try to impose upon God necessarily is falsified by the reality that God actually is, which is the ongoing problem of perfect being theology. If you start with this idea that God is all good, omnipresent, all knowing, all the omnis, then you get to saying on and immutable. That's always the big one, where it's like, well, hang on a second, does God become flesh or not? Because if God becomes flesh, and that's a new thing even for God, then you can't. Then all that baggage has to take the back seat, and stands in, and the gospel stands in judgment over it. And of course, then once you've acknowledged that God can become flesh, then we realize what Torrance says in several places, which is God was always Father, but God was not always Creator. God became Creator. God obviously always could have been Creator, but it was still something new for God. And what I appreciate so much is that by the rigorous Christocentrism that Torrance gives us shows us the proper procedure. And I find it fascinating. Like, one of the things that I was just surprised by, to a certain degree, when I was doing my initial work that became my dissertation, was Torrance was developing an epistemology that came from overtly Christian sources. It came from his way of understanding reality in general was clearly the outgrowth of how we come to know God. And yet, once that's injected into our thought, we could take it and run it in a bunch of different ways because we're dealing with contingent order. But I just found it totally captivating that this idea of the gospel should have something to say with how we do our natural science as well. And what at least the sense I've gotten from those I've encountered in the theology science discussion is that there's usually a little more reluctance for theologians to pipe up and say, what we know about God and Christ should actually impact how we engage with the created world. So all this is to say is that, that Torrance is really doing some pretty radical stuff here. He's not absolutely all. I mean, again, so to speak, this questioning of the hegemony of Euclid was kind of in the water, so to speak. There was it was a thought whose time had more or less come. So he's not totally alone, but it's important to realize that Torrance is making some pretty big statements here. That I think that someone who was not already prepared to question Euclid and that kind of perspective would find difficult.
So can I ask why? I love geometry. Of all the maths, I probably love geometry the most, and yet I find it hard to be the test point of what is meant by pure intelligence. Yep. It's like it has an application to it, and if I'm hearing you right, it's seen by Torrance to be too abstract in a sense. It has an abstraction of arguments that in the end don't really meet all the needs, but why it is the touchstone of what you called pure intelligence, that doesn't make sense to me.
Well, because it is, we realize now that, sorry, let me back up. Historically, we were aware of the fact that there's this massive development of this pile of theorems, mathematical theorems that are all, once you take those first 5 postulates, absolutely 100% definitely timelessly, spacelessly true. Mm-hmm. And so it is this absolute model of ultimate rigor. It's one of those things where, so here's a story from modern mathematics I think helps get at this idea of how mathematicians think. And that is, so Andrew Wiles was the man who eventually proved Fermat's last theorem. But he's gone on the record to say he received professional pressure. Don't tell anybody you're working on this. You might get denied promotions. You might lose your job over this because you're spending your time pursuing something that nobody believed was really going to be solvable. There was this kind of politics of the mathematical department. And it took him, I think, something like 3 days for him to actually go through the proof of the theorem. And it was clearly he was utilizing mathematical tools that did not exist or were not known by Fermat at the time. And so people started to realize where he was going with all this. And the point, though, is when he's finally all done, basically, I'm sure there's always people who want to be contentious, but basically, before that point, there was nobody who would say that Fermat's last theorem was proven. And after it's done, it's proved. There's not really a question about it. How the nature of how proof works in mathematics is so utterly rigorous. Again, you always have individuals who are contentious, but as a general rule, it's so utterly, that it's not a question. You don't get debate in general in mathematicians about the validity of a proof. You you might get about the various scientific theories. It's not just looking at the same thing from a different angle. It's either have you demonstrated it beyond question or have you not. And so that's what I mean by being kind of this rigid intelligence. Now, what's fascinating about it is that it's pure intelligence because we realize now that it's built on nothing other than itself. It is a completely fideistic system.
Young El wants to throw something in there.
Yes, just a minor pushback on that.
Please.
Even with mathematical proofs, I think in modern day, some of the proofs have become so long, and they are in principle reducible to a formal sequence of statements, but usually they are done in an informal manner. Therefore, there's always room that even the proof, even if the whole community accepts it, there might be a hidden error that could be revealed later. And then secondly, there are some proofs that have required computers to prove, like the simple groups, etc., where we know what needs to be done, but in order to do it, it'll take so long. We program computers to do all these test cases. So a human being is not actually doing the proof. We now have an algorithm that checks to see if it's true or not, but then we have to trust the algorithm because the proof is 600 pages long, right? So I would just say that traditionally math has been that way, but today the complexity is raising some doubts. Okay.
Well, and that is true. It is true also that even in the last 20 years, the use of computers for these kinds of things has gone up a lot, which means, where this has really jumped up in the controversy is after I was done studying math. So I'm aware of some of the complications that are on there. But so the point that I want to say here, well, why it's kind of pure intelligence, is because we realize now that what holds Euclid together are those basic postulates. It's not actually based on experience at all. And because it is unchallengeable by, in fact, there's a joke, among mathematicians, where it's like people, some mathematicians resent when their work is taken and applied to real life. They liked the beauty and the purity of just being an expression of their raw intelligence and kind of the game of it. In fact, it was so funny because I had a friend of mine who his PhD in mathematics was in number theory, and it was so funny because for a while, there used to be a time when number theory was considered to be almost the least useful out of all the fields, and yet now it's so deeply embedded into cryptology or cryptography that there really is no such thing as absolutely pure mathematics that has no application anymore, almost, at least. But it's fascinating. So the rest of the world looks at mathematicians and say, what's the point? What do you gain from all this? And the mathematician says that is not a question we ask here. It's a different way of thinking. It's a different world in which you live in. And it's not. So it's a fascinating notion that there have been over the years, there have been mathematicians who have been annoyed when physicists and other scientists come along and take their work and apply it to the real world, because it's no longer this pure thing. Now it's been in their mind corrupted almost. But I find that a fascinating cultural phenomenon.
So to say, as we go into this chapter, that abstraction is what Torrance wants to avoid, because the nature of the gospel and theological science is dealing with the world, that can be empirically engaged. And so the pushback as we enter into the logic of man is that much of what would be called the logic of man has an abstraction that keeps it from that applicability and engagement with reality that is problematic. Is that a fair?
Yeah, so I think there's a certain amount where logic is seen as abstracted, totally abstracted. But I think there's also a sense in which, because of the sheer power of logic, which it is, it's a remarkably powerful tool. And part of what Neil was getting at a little bit ago was that we have some of these things where we can one of the great projects of Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead was to try to codify mathematics. And it's like 100 and some pages to prove 1 + 1 = 2. It's kind of a famous, thing. But the point that we're trying to do is, because if we can really reduce all these things to symbolisms that hold in reliable ways, we can take relatively simple amounts of information and come to these seemingly remarkable conclusions. We can trace them back to the way. But the problem then is when you start to assume that if I take data from the real world and I apply all these algorithmic, and formal logical things to it, then reality has to behave the same way that symbolic logic does. And I think that's another danger that Torrance has, is to one, think that a separate logic is sufficient, and also the assumption that there's not a gap between formal logic and reality, I think, is also a danger that he's worried about.
Okay, Young Ill wanted to say something there.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get into philosophy of mathematics, but the idea that math has no relevance, I think, is a very modern thing, like 19th century, because geometry in ancient times was experience of measuring the earth, right? Geometry, and drawing circles and drawing triangles. Now, granted, the abstraction thereof, that Euclid's axioms, is an abstraction, and dealing with infinity is a problem, like the parallel line postulate, right? I mean, I can draw a line that doesn't touch, but I cannot extend it to infinity where it may or may not touch. So, and then I think the relevance of calculus, for example, came out of physics. So even the foundation of a major area of math is based on trying to solve the physics of Newtonian physics, right? So for a mathematician to say that there's nothing practical about it is sort of I think sort of I don't know. It's a kind of a vacuous declaration given the history. So
it doesn't have to be that way.
That's right.
And it hasn't always been that way. So
that's right.
But for the purposes of what it is that Torrance is doing, he's wanting to say, if human logic looks like something that's separated away, it's not going to serve in the way that theology would do. So we have to clarify, what are we doing,
Right.
Right.
right?
So I mean, so the kind of big picture of this chunk of text is that we have statements, and statements need to be related in some capacity to reality, but statements are also related to other statements, and so they have to have so there's a sense in which they have to make there has to be an interior logic, which is a closer analog to what you guys were talking about last time with Paul. That it has to the relationship with reality has to be there. But then there's also, as they relate to each other, it is logic in a different, more abstract sense. And part of the point that Torrance wants to get at is that if you get to the point where you have a kind of self-contained, self-consistent, abstract system that doesn't actually ever touch contact with reality that we actually experience, it's a problem. And so for example, I mean, he'll go into this like in the Christian doctrine of God. He'll talk about this idea of there are certain empirical correlates that need to be in place for the doctrine of the Trinity to make any sense. Like, for example, we talk about the virgin birth and the empty tomb. It's not so much that the mere fact that a virgin had a baby is already inherently intrinsically theological, but given what it points to, and the empty tomb, all these are moments where if we had a perfectly consistent theological system that never actually intersected with this world of space and time, then we're back to the ancient Greek charismos, between the sensible world and the intelligible world, which means as abstract and as consistent as it may be, it doesn't actually affect you and me, which is a problem.
So he's beginning this chapter discussing Euclidean geometry because he wants to clarify that human logic has a tradition that maybe we might say has a tendency to abstraction. And we need to clarify that there is appropriate human logic, but it has to begin with the from to-ness of God. And that the whole a posteriori sense of what is logical is that there is a reality to which and to say the word logic and logos, or words or reasoning, that from which we begin to make words and claims and reasoning has to be something that is truly part of this world. So the logic of man appropriately is a logic that begins with God. I mean, is another way of saying that.
Yeah. Well, I want to be clear the fact that I started with Euclid. I don't think Torrance did. I mean, Torrance, I think, is responding in large ways to Frege's work and the Principia Mathematica of Russell and Whitehead. I tend to jump to Euclid because I find most people who are outside of the world of mathematics at least have some background with Euclidean geometry, and a lot of the modern mathematics is trying to respond to some of the problems that we've come up with over the years.
Yeah. So the use of Euclid for you, though, provides a model to move through this section on the logic of man that shows traditional forms of logic begin with the human, but the human in its abstract components. And Torrance is going to say we can't do that. We have to begin with something that has a concrete reality. We might use the word empirical there. And then from that, we can discern a form of logic. And our disclosure models are going to help us to get to that. But it is very much Katafusan all the way down, right?
Right. So I mean, it's worth realizing that Torrance will also use other terms as more or less synonyms of logic. He'll talk about inner logic, but he'll also talk about inherent intelligibility and inner rationality. And so it's one of those things where, like, man, I never got more fire for anything than by talking about Torrance some of the truth of being. Oh man, does a lot of the world not like the notion of the truth of being? It's amazing to me. But so I even at one point commented in the dissertation, I said, if you just want to think about it as just reality, call it good. That's fine. He's using it in the same way. But in the same way, if somebody finds logic to be a word that has distorting baggage, this idea of the inherent sensibility, rationality of whatever it is we're looking at is what we're talking about. So for example, I mean, Torrance never uses this, but for example, the inherent intelligibility of a human being, you could say, involves our cardiovascular system and our respiratory system and all these, and our nervous system, all the rest. That this is part of what makes us work. It's the inner intelligibility that makes us function as we are. I don't want to push that real hard, but this idea of if you were to say, well, I want to understand human beings, but I don't ever want to think about blood. Well, there are going to be things you will not be able to know about human beings if you get rid of blood or if you get rid of nerves and those kind of things, because it's part of what makes us who we are, not from a existential point of view, but from a physical point of view.
So the reality of the human body gives rise to the fact that we use language about it, and medicine isn't only the textbooks about it, it's the ability to actually engage the human body and to interact with it in a way appropriate to it. So when he begins this section to say, God's logic is based on revelation, it's something given to us, and so our words have to correspond with the givenness there, and the human is based on human activities, and that's the activities of questioning, of investigation, all of these things. And so at some level, when he goes on in the second paragraph to say, to think is to think relations, the nature of relations, so we're getting the nature of thinking and relations being brought together here. So we know relativity, Einsteinian wise, Newton had everything in a box, which I assume maybe is not relations. So Euclidean geometry and Newtonian thinking both have a level of human abstraction by separating things that should be held together in their interaction. And the nature of theological science is going to reinvigorate the interrelatedness of all things that is more like Einsteinian relativity. Is that a fair foundation for
Yeah,
where he's
but a bit in as much. So, I mean, Newtonian science is about relations, but it's a very specific kinds of relations. That a lot of classical mechanics wanted to reduce the relevant variables to things like just mass, momentum, those kinds of things, and so you end up introducing more of those as time goes on. So it's one of those things where Newtonian science gets us a long way, but like for example, one of the classic things he couldn't solve was the rotation of the perihelion of Mercury, and which Einsteinian relativity does. So it's not necessarily that there's not relations involved. It's that it is not fully relational enough. But it's not. I mean, because in the classic Newtonian problem, the problem still today is the three-body problem. You can describe like the gravitational forces on two bodies with as much precision as you want, but with three bodies, it has been demonstrated to be fairly impossible, at least with anything we know now. And so it's one of those things where it's not that there are no relations; it's just they're very, very specific about the kinds of relations that they care about or that they think are relevant.
Right. So the nature of relations that deal with the actual physical word, I mean, that's one of the phrases that you have in your opening paragraph, is that there's something about the nature of the actual physical world, which you use the word reality for that. But there's something that Torrance is going to, argue that the logic of man has to deal with reality, or it's become something that is problematic and isn't connected to reality. Our thinking has been detached from reality at some level. And therefore
Right.
there's an appropriateness to go to the revelation of God in Christ to begin doing logic. And it's particularly theologic, but it has a grounding in something that it's not just us, and I'm using the word, overtly guessing that we're right with the questions we're asking, because you can ask all kinds of questions and really miss the questions that needed to be asked in your human kind of logic. So I think Torrance's kind of principle of always questioning the questions, are we asking the right questions, is part of the methodology of getting realigned in our theological thinking as well as our general sense of logic.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about this. So also, if we come at Jesus with this notion of, well, he's either got to be really God or he's got to be really human. We can't really be both because we've already decided that these two are discrete, things. Well, then we are trying to impose a system on top of the human, the hypostatic union, and we see this in a parallel way with light. It's if we say it is either has to be only a particle or only a wave, it can't be both. Well, then you get into a lot of problems. If once you allow light to set its own terms, so to speak, on how it's going to be understood, we realize that our previous dichotomy between particles and waves is insufficient.
Right.
And
So
the thing,
part,
right? So, but part of what that says is, whatever might be true in every other case, we realize in light it doesn't work. It's like, I had someone come to me one time and he says, well, I was presenting something like this. This is ages and ages ago. And they said, you must be wrong about Jesus being God for us, not realizing quite all what they were saying. This is a Christian who was saying this to me, because God is infinite and Jesus is finite. And therefore, there's a limit to Jesus being God for us. And what I wasn't enough, I had thought things through well enough to realize, like, well, here's the thing. What Jesus shows us is that the finite and the infinite, at least by the power of God, are not fundamentally incompatible. They might be incompatible in every other place in the whole universe, but not in this one. In this one man, we see that the infinite and the finite absolutely can coexist. Now, maybe not by nature, maybe that, but by the power of God, the infinite and the finite are compatible in Christ.
uh-huh.
And so, but the point is, it's like, things. And so, what the trick is what you're making at that point is you're making you're still making what could be an abstract point, which is, something can be true in 99.99, percent of the time, but that 0.01% says, but you can't say it as a blanket statement. It's not an absolute. You cannot make it as an absolute claim, even if it's true in the overwhelming majority of cases. And that's the importance of letting actuality stand in judgment over our universalizing statements.
So we can't say Mary couldn't have had a virgin birth because that just doesn't happen. We
Right.
have to say it happened once and only
Right.
once, but that
Right.
once was enough to change everything, right? I mean, that's
Right.
the particularity of the event where our minds have to be readapted to the reality of what happened rather than the other way.
Well, right, and that's the trick is to be able to say, on the one hand, to say that virgins do not give birth is strictly false from the Christian perspective. Doesn't necessarily mean virgins are, not, so that's part of the problem, is that the Western philosophical tradition wants to say, well, if it could happen once, it could happen an infinite number of times. And we're saying, well, maybe whether it could or whether it couldn't, it doesn't. It is as much of a law of nature as you want, but you still can't make it as a blanket statement that no virgins ever give birth, if you buy the Christian narrative.
Right. So at the top of 223, the distinction between empirical form and systematic form, the nature of the empirical it's kind of almost another word for engaging reality there, right? Whereas systematic is the systems of thoughts that humans build for logic.
Right.
And so
so
go ahead.
This whole chapter, or this whole part of the chapter, is going to be dealing with this basic distinction over and over and over and over and over again. We saw it in the last chapter as well, of the basic distinction between existence statements and coherent statements. And the idea is, so existence statements are statements about what is external to themselves, what exists independent of them.
And are empirically engaged. The empirical is
right,
the human experience of it, right?
Right. There are things that they are. Sorry. So existence statements are making ontological claims. Empirical form is what do we actually encounter and experience? Yeah.
Okay.
But they're both. But it's still that same. There's art where there's the pointing outward, and then there's the looking inward. So when you have existence statements, they're statements that look outside of themselves to external reality. The coherent statements are how, like, my statement here may not have a direct external reality they're talking about, but it's necessary to make sense out of our system of statements. So for example, with the mathematical analogy, you might have mathematical things that to be true, things that you have proven, logical consequences of what you've already demonstrated that at least so far has no external reality. We know it. It doesn't necessarily have any experiential value, but it is still part of the system that is implied by everything else. So what Torrance is trying to say is there is a sense in which, essentially, one of the things he's going to get at is we have these statements about reality, about our experience, about all these different things. And we do actually have to find a way for them to make sense together, because creation and, well, certainly the being of God and then creation is not fundamentally irrational. It's not fundamentally incoherent. So, if we say, here's 10 statements that we want to say are true about a tree, at some point we need to find some way for those things to cohere together, to have a system of thought, about it. And if we find that some of our statements about that tree don't agree with other statements, it might be that some of those statements are wrong. And it might be that we need to think through the system differently. but the nature of the mistake, you can't tell a priori. You can only tell after the fact. You need to be able to engage with that way. And there's some other things in the background here. I make a comment later on about the Duan-Quine hypothesis.
So my dad was a science teacher, high school science teacher, and he called himself an empiricist. And he talked about converting out of Christianity because it didn't have the empirical whatever it was that he was looking for. So he loved to study, electricity and all the things that he could teach kids about, but he just didn't find Christianity empirically satisfying. So he kind of threw out the system of Christianity, even though he was a pastor's kid, a Presbyterian minister. So to say, we live in a world, and Torrance is standing right here at the beginning, I think, saying we have to hold these together. There has to be an engagement with reality, and we have to be able to talk about it in ways that function together. And if you choose one or the other, you are losing either too much of reality, or you're losing the ability to be thoughtful humans in your engagement with the world.
Yeah.
Right? So, and ultimately, theological science needs to do both. Mark, I see that hand.
Hi, Marty. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Hi, gentlemen. The thought just struck me that, in Hebrews it says that it is by faith that we know that God created the world, or the cosmos. So there is no empiricism that in faith. You know what I'm saying? That the faith comes before any experience, any empiricism.
Maybe.
Do you guys agree with that?
If you begin with revelation, that the nature of the God who's revealed in the writing of the Old and the New Testament, that the witness of revelation would say God created the world. So you're not starting with mere observing the world. You are empirically engaging the revelation of God who has made himself known. And so I think that falls into the realm of an empirical engagement with revelation, where you're not trying to read off of the order of the world itself, which would be natural theology, but you are taking seriously. And so faith then is corresponding to acknowledging the revelation of God, that God is the creator. And so you are accepting that the nature of the world that you see there, and this is the from to part that is just further down the page, comes from the one who speaks and says, I am the one who did that. Right? So you are accepting that it is orderly. It is the space within which we live and move and breathe and have our very existence, and we would not exist without it. And so we could say it's all just by chance, or we could say, no way. The empirical evidence is that God has said he made it. It looks like it's been made. And I'm going to acknowledge the empirical reality of that holding together, and then make the statement, I believe, not just as a belief based on nothing, but based on the evidence.
So I'm assuming you're talking about Hebrews 11:3 here, which by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God. So what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. I mean, I think that's a fair statement. We don't experience the creation of the world by God. The act of creation, it all happened, before we were born. Anything else, we don't necessarily. So we do experience the world, and we can, and that's like you could be a brilliant astrophysicist, and you can cosmology and all the rest, but you would never be able to logically conclude that this must have been created by the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. There is, so it's what's fascinating is not everything in faith is directly experienceable. Like we didn't directly experience like the Spirit raising Christ from the dead, right? We don't directly experience the Christ's resurrection ourselves. Other people had bore witness to it. There were empirical correlates to the resurrection. When we say the resurrection is the key, we can point to things that are in this world that are empirical, even if they're not directly experienced by us. And so it's one of those things where you cannot reduce you cannot reduce the significance of the resurrection to the fact that the tomb is empty. And yet the fact that the tomb is empty is a vitally important correlate that, if it were not so, would definitely challenge the proclamation of Christians. So
right.
this is where what Torrance will say.
It's a sign.
Right.
I think Karl Barth always said, look, this is a sign, and it points to something beyond itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why, if you were to have a theological perspective, and there are theological perspectives out there, and at some point you say, okay, you have all of these ideas, but where does this actually intersect our world? And if a lot of them don't, or they're kind of these fanciful things. But Torrance will say explicitly, later on, especially Christian Doctrine of God, he will really go to some length to say, our theological perspectives, even our most abstract, theological constructions at the third the third level, I think it's the second theological level, they themselves, are actual comments about the intra-Trinitarian relations are not things that you and I experience directly, and yet, given what we do experience, we feel we can say nothing else. And I think that's a crucial sense there. And it's also important because for one thing that Torrance will talk about is he will talk about ways in which we keep our inner subjectivity in check, and part of that is by what he will call in other books, God, world, man relations. God, world, human relationship, where it's one of those things where I can experience somebody, another person, and I will have the experience that I have with them, and I might hear stories about how other people experience that person. But when I see them, it's one of those things where it's like if you see hidden cameras, right? If you saw someone responding in a way that's dramatically out of character when you weren't around to see it, it might change your perspective of things, because there's a sense in which what you're seeing is more objective, in the sense that you're not imposing your subjectivity on that person, on that experience, on that event. Doesn't necessarily make it more true. It might be one of the things where that's the thing that's out of character. But this idea of the empty tomb is important in part because it is, we could convince ourselves that Christ is raised, even if the tomb is not empty. And as long as we keep the tomb sealed, we kind of have Schrodinger's, Christ, so to speak. But once you look,
I think also that's why we have the eyewitness statements.
Right.
Those are absolutely essential. We go by what our brothers and sisters before us have seen.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
and it's true. And it is true that if we are wrong on that fundamental point, if Christ is not raised, Paul says we are of all people mostly pitied.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On 223, about 2/3 of the way down, he talks about this elementary mistake to assume that we can state in statements how statements are related to what is stated, and so reduce all relations to linguistic relations. So in a sense, the creation of the world, if we just end up saying, well, it's just our statements that we believe it, but it doesn't actually relate to the relation of the God creating the world in which we live and function, that there has to be a coherence between our statements and reality, so that our faith can never just be faith in the statement. It's faith that the statement corresponds to the reality of the God who creates, and that there are witnesses and God's revelation that are the basis upon which our logic is being formed. And at that point, the word logic and faith virtually mean the same thing.
Right. So that's the thing, is our goal kind of always is to have our system of statements that we express in language to be as close of a correlation to the relations in fact as they actually are. And so but the point though is if we ever get to the point where we just assume that they are the same, that's when we can fall into an error. Because our system may work great, but if we don't continually check it against reality, then we might just assume that things are the way our system says they are.
So in your middle paragraph on your first page, logic is for Torrance concerned with the relation of things with other things. Could that also include persons with other persons? Is that
Yeah,
With
yeah. I'm
so,
sorry. I don't mean things in a depersonalizing, dehumanizing sense. I mean as
right.
stuff. You know.
Because that is a
So, but
definition within certain forms of science would literally say only things, the personal is outside the scope. So I just wanted to clarify that
well,
all of that is
I mean, here's that. So I think that part of the fascinating part of what Torrance is doing is here. I think they would also apply to God, but I don't mean to depersonalize God in the midst of all that. It's just phrasing in the most. If you say it's one thing to say God has an interior rationality. Okay, fine, but what does that necessarily mean for anything else? Well, then you can say. So my goal was trying to say it in a general way that would include but not be limited to persons.
well, he does go there when he talks about God is love, right?
Right.
I mean, he's literally going where you just went of saying there is
Mhm.
something of the logic of God that the statement God is love is a statement that refers to an actuality that exists between Father, Son, Spirit,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
So, and with Paul
But that's
last
the point,
week,
though. That's the point. But the role of the word love in that statement has to be defined by the actuality of the love of God. It can't. We
exactly,
cannot start because if we come at that with a statement of, oh, I think I already know what love is like, even the most noble that I can think of, love, then I'm going to distort it. I'm going to come to erroneous conclusions. So even still, God needs to be defined by the reality of God. Love needs to be defined by the reality of God, and so does the word is. It all has to be defined.
yeah.
By that.
I think
So
Karl
last week
Barth
was,
actually said, sorry, Marty.
but
I think Karl Barth actually said, God is love, but you cannot reverse that order. It needs to,
Right.
you cannot say love is God.
yeah, Torrance says that in this section as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think if we were absolutely, deliberately, rigorously committed to defining love absolutely Christologically, maybe. But the problem is, of course, that we don't generally do that, and it is a perilous, at the very best, way of doing things. Because we'd have to. So at that point, we'd be saying love, the kind of love that we actually know God to be through Christ in the power of the Holy Spirit. Then that is what God is. Well, that is true. But that's not how people use that phrase. So that's
Yeah,
so. By the way, making my theoretical possibility, I am not advocating for turning that sentence around because I think that the danger they see is very real, and
right.
our human capacity to avoid that error is essentially non-existent. So I'm making an abstract point, not a practical ministerial point.
Yeah. And we're establishing a logic of sequence that we always
Right.
have to begin with the nature of God when doing theological work and not with the human. It gets a little
Right.
bit tricky, as it was last week with Paul Molnar. We bumped heads a little bit over the word emotion,
Yes.
which John McMurray, says every act has a motive. And so does God act in the world? Yes. Why does God act in the world? Well, God loves the very being that we've just been talking about with Torrance. Um, so the nature of motive is that it lives in the emotive world. And Paul says, no, God can't have feelings. We can't put feelings. It's like, well, that's not the way that McMurray is using the word motive or emotive.
Mm.
God's love is actually perfect. And so if we say, if we are going to use the word motive, it has to begin with the nature of the God who acts in the world, who loves the world, and therefore demonstrate that in the sending of the Son and the Spirit. The word emotive and motive have to be defined first by who God is, and then we can say, wow, look at how humans mess up motives. Look at the nature of the lies that they take. So do not lie to one another since you've laid aside the old self with its evil practices. And that's because they've missed the love of God. So Bill and I have been
Bill,
having a
yeah.
conversation on this.
Well, he brought it up
Go
to
ahead.
me independently, and it didn't make sense to put in the outline here. But I wondered. So this is part of my. So much of kind of my life is applied psychology as well, and I think about, and I'm wondering. So I don't know
But
precisely what
theological
your
psychology, right? I mean, the very
well,
point we're
no,
making here is
yeah,
how do we do the care of the human based from the life of God?
right. But what I mean is, so what's your theological background, Marty? Is it some kind of Presbyterianism?
My grandfather is a Presbyterian minister. I got my doctorate at the Presbyterian Training Hall of New Zealand. I have 3 degrees from the Assemblies of God.
Okay,
And
so what I'm
I've
saying though
worked
is
in
what I'm
4
saying.
non-denominational churches.
So in
Which
my
kind do
experience,
you
right?
want? What's
So
that?
I'm part of the Global Methodist Church, right? But I was part
Yes.
of the United Methodist Church. And
Yep.
so one of the dangers that one of the things, it's fascinating to me. This I think is a really fascinating thing about the Torrance crowd because, a lot, especially kind of the early days of this reading group, we would kind of ask everybody who came on, how did you come to encounter Torrance? And kind of the first time we
Yep.
talked about it, we do that. And it was amazing to me because person after person after person from these very conservative, Reformed traditions, all basically were saying the same thing, which was, oh my goodness, it was a breath of fresh air. We didn't have to be so rigid. We didn't have to be so legalistic, in our interpretation. And I just couldn't have a laugh because with my background, I said, oh my goodness, here's someone who's got his feet on the ground, who actually knows what the heck he's talking about and is not going to get blown to and fro with whatever happens to be going on at the time. So it's entirely, I wonder to a certain degree, I wonder if, Paul's context in the Catholic Church, is more similar to mine. So like when someone talks about emotion, I'm going to have an immediate hesitation because I'm gonna be like, whoa, let's not bring that into it, because if what we mean by that is, oh, God has emotions like I do, well, that's not necessarily precise. Now, but the point though is that if you're not coming from that kind of background, then you may not have the same, kind of instinctive reaction to it that people like me do. Right. So I wonder to a certain degree if the question about no emotion or no mere emotion may have it might be partly due to the baggage that we bring to that word, of emotion. Yeah. Now, I tend to think in terms of wholes. I'd like to think of myself as thinking in terms of wholes. That if we're involving the person, well, of course we're involving the emotions in some capacity, because how in the world could you not? But at the same time, like
out of the world could you not?
Right. I mean, so one of the things that I made a comment about when we were talking about previous session, I mentioned Ronald Pieman and got really caught up in that, where one of the things that I think he missed was when Torrance says things like Jesus Christ is the truth, who does not communicate himself apart from truths and does not communicate truths apart from himself. And this idea of, even when we say truth, we don't just mean the statement of it. We're talking about the reality that's behind it. And so for me, this idea of, it is very easy for me to think in those holes and not partition out some of those things. But if you're coming from a background where that is a real danger,
Yeah. Well, the way I read this section is that Torrance is doing the work of trying to clarify appropriate human logic that has the from to, and that we acknowledge the nature of the reality. And we can take any word, and in a sense, we can ask, is this true to the nature of God? And in the questioning, who Jesus is, what is revealed, we either can say it can fill this word out or it can't. And the word love, God is love, is the word he used as an example. He didn't use the word emotive with it, or anything that was in the realm of motive. So he's shy about that, shall we say. I don't know that he excluded it. And so the logic of the section, I think, is we just have to be scientists who keep saying, well, let's try this on. If it fills out by who God is, then we can use it as a from that, then we can make a claim. Bill's waiting to say something there.
Well, yeah, I mean, the statement was, this is not love in the form of emotion. This is love in the form of personal union. And hey, be transformed by the renewing of your irrational emotions. That's not what Paul wrote in Romans. He said, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And there, love God. I think Torrance didn't, I don't believe Torrance misstepped. I believe he's right on with what he said there. I mean, what it was his background in relation to emotions. Well, think of his family. I don't think he was shy of emotions at all, and I don't think what you're implying that, Travis. But I too grew up in the Methodist Church, by the way.
Sure.
Yeah.
People come out of the Methodist Church.
Torrance is speaking of the logic of the personal, the love of the personal union. I think he's talking about that which is before the foundation of the world, the hypostatic union of man and God to be in Jesus Christ. I mean, why Why does there have to be human emotion? By the way, McMurray in that chapter is talking about Josephine and Jane. He's talking about human relations, right? He doesn't mention the union of God and man in there. I don't understand why Torrance even referenced McMurray in that.
I do
Because he's
know
a fan.
he's a fan of McMurray, and I think the point that Torrance wants to make, I'm not reading that we have to read just human emotion. I'm wanting to argue. I'm writing a book on the science of the personal, and I want to argue that the nature of what it means to engage the God who is God the Father, who sends the Son, who sends the Spirit, invites us into a life of union, that the nature of the word motive of love is something that is purely spoken of God. And we need to be able to say, God has the only example of what pure motive looks like. And ours, it can align with God's, and then it's a motive that's aligned with God's. And when it's not, our motives have gone awry and we fall prey to lie. So I need to be able to establish that there's something that is true in God that gets warped in us, and it is the basis of understanding the psychology of the brokenness of humanity to be able to have that kind of language. And that the nature of every act of God, we can say there's a motive behind that. God acts every time, every way because of love, even when he's disciplining and correcting. God disciplines us that we may share his holiness. So to be able to establish there is a purity in the motive of the love of God, and it calls into question our world of emotion in a way that we can now appropriately question it because it doesn't align with his. So I'm just wanting to protect using the word emotion appropriately used, as I think he's trying to argue for in this chapter, in this section of the chapter.
God loves because he loves, Paul Molnar.
Well, so my mathematical training to tear things apart in analysis has been largely modified by my experience in pastoral ministry of realizing people are unbelievably complicated wholes.
They are.
So I obviously see my kind of thoughts in the whole thing is I want to reject the thought feeling dichotomy altogether. I want to.
That's just McMurray. Yeah.
Like I say, I'm not read it all, McMurray, actually. But like,
have you read Reason and Emotion? That's the argument of Reason and Emotion is the dichotomy is inappropriate.
I have read no McMurray.
No McMurray. Well, that's not very much.
Right. But yeah, that idea of like so again, for me, I'm hesitant to talk about emotions, but part of it is because I wonder what we are adding by the label of emotions, and if there's any sense in which we are dividing the person, that makes me worry. But I mean, that of course, here's the thing, though, right? So one of my ongoing debates with other St. Andrews students when I was there was there was a pervasive desire to assign certain elements and aspects to one of the natures of Christ, and I don't see the benefit of doing that, and I see a huge liability of doing that. But that's partly because I, in my experience, tend to see the danger of separating the natures as being a more real and present danger in my context, than maybe they do. So I at least want to open the possibility that if you see people collapsing the persons collapsing the natures in such a way that is destructive to people and thinking, I could imagine why you might want to take different steps. But anyway.
Yes. And again, this section is just, it's hitting in all the things that I'm preparing to write a book on. So sure. I'm wanting to be true to Torrance, and I'm wanting to be true to the nature of theological science, and to say what I think Torrance was saying, the world of the social sciences need to catch up with what it is that theology has done and the physical sciences have done. They're lagging behind because they're still just building out of the human, and they're not letting God determine the nature of even a word like emotions. To begin to say God is the only one who can have pure emotions. Now we can talk about pure emotions because God determines it. And now we can talk about the brokenness of humanity, because now we have what I think Torrance is saying is the logic of God and God's revelation that gives us the basis to then be corrective of all those things now in the social sciences that we can talk about. Otherwise, it's just off the table. And I would say it runs wild, and it's just your opinion, my opinion, rather than being grounded in the actuality of the love of God in Christ. So for me, that's why it's really important. Yes, Mark.
Thank you, Marty. I totally agree, and I think your book is going to be a real help here because Karl Barth used to say he didn't describe God and his attributes. He described God and his perfections.
Yes.
And now, when you see Jesus wept, here is the eternal Word, who is God,
Yeah.
in flesh and blood form, and he weeps.
Hmm.
So I think that's a strong point for your book there.
Yeah. Well, even in the perfections, God talks about God's wrath as the outworking of his love. It's the burning love of God. So to say, even wrath, we can't just understand God's really mad. We have to understand, even in God's wrath, God is acting in a way that is a purifying kind of love. So the whole nature of the logic of God has to see God for who God is and not fall into the, well, if God destroys those people, if God floods the world, then God must be that kind of God who gets mad and destroys and all that. It's like, no, 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 no. You've missed the heart of God. You've missed the motive life of God that always acts in love, without question, without deviation.
I bet Torrance understands all of that, and yet he said what he said.
And what I'm trying to learn from it is how to say he said it, and therefore he was probably wanting to be corrective of something in the same way that Paul jumped to, not feelings. It's like we need to articulate we mean this and not that. But
Mhm.
if we see not emotive, we need to say not that kind of emotive, but we need to do what this section is now saying, always beginning with the logic of revelation of God, and to let even a word like motive and emotive be fulfilled first by God before we say anything about the nature of the human. Though he didn't say that here, I see it's where I think that he is going with the logic of this section of the logic of the human. So take us on to your second page there, Travis, on your handout.
Somebody's muted.
You're muted,
Sorry,
yes.
I didn't realize I was muted. I'm so sorry about that.
Yes, you were just
I
like
was,
God, you were immutable.
yeah, right. No, except that's not what I said earlier. Sorry. What in particular do you have in mind on page 2 here?
Just go ahead to the logic of existence statement. So we're moving kind of over to page.
Sure.
Well, I mean, there was the whole issue of analytic work on 225. He seems to be somewhat resistant to analytic because analytic's another word for beginning with the human, analyzing from a human perspective. Is that a fair? His concern is that these are different forms of the same
Yeah, I think so. I mean, yeah. So the thing about these sections is that he's really making very similar points over and over and over again from slightly different
problem.
angles.
Yeah.
Um,
And we want to hear the
so
nuance of what those angles are.
right, but it's one of those things where if we don't spend a lot of time on every single iteration, it's not the end of
Yep.
the world.
Yep. That's fine too. It's just one
Okay.
that because there is the analytical school of theology that's functioning at St. Andrews. That I've asked several of them. So where do you stand when you do your analytic work?
Yeah.
Right, and it generally isn't the point where I would like them to stand in doing that. Well, we're just using the tools of analytic philosophy. Well, that sounds like a misstep.
Well, I mean, and that's the thing is, I would imagine, and they started that after I left. Um, but I would imagine that when I think about where an analysis is helpful is to really sit down in actual usage and but again, you understand. I think my favorite analytic philosopher is Wittgenstein. I don't know that everyone would agree that the later Wittgenstein was an analytic philosopher, but I think he's the analytic philosopher par excellence. He's amazing. I think he is such a careful thinker.
So
I
can
read
you
philosophical investigations every year.
Yeah.
I
So
love
can
it.
you
about-
just
what
articulate
about his-
what is it about him that makes him so workable for you? Can you say that in a simple sentence?
For Wittgenstein?
For Wittgenstein,
Yeah,
yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean, why is it you're so
I
what
find
is
him so
he?
fascinating because he has a kind of, there's a famous passage where he talks about he lists several different games, and then he says, well, what holds them all together? And he says, don't think, look. And I appreciate that. How I read him anyway is because I realize that he's a controversial figure in some ways. I see him as being relentlessly concrete in the sense of, like, don't assume you know the answer just because you haven't thought about it for a while. Actually look and actually see and actually pay attention to what you're actually doing. And I like that focus on actuality. Now, I appreciate there's all kinds of relativists who will read him in a very different way. But I just find I find philosophical investigations to be a fascinating text.
Good.
Quick question then. So that's how you describe him as an analytic philosopher, as opposed to his earlier Tractatus? I
Okay.
thought by the time he got to philosophical investigations, he's no longer analytical.
Okay, so as I said, I realize I am probably being very idiosyncratic in my assessment here. What I mean by him being an analytic philosopher is that he's being relentless about, let's actually look at what we're actually doing, and that
Right.
kind of close attention
Real
to
language.
detail, real language.
Yeah.
I see that as being precisely the kind of thing that analytic philosophy should be doing, which is, instead of saying, "Well, everybody knows," I think about all the times I've heard someone say, "No, well, nobody doubts X." Almost always, that X is something for which there is no proof whatsoever. Because if there was proof, you would share it. And if your only response is, "Well, nobody believes that," I find that difficult. But again, so I appreciate. I have read almost nothing on Wittgenstein, and I got to be honest, his Tractatus is beyond me. I don't fully understand the Tractatus at all. But I love the philosophical investigations. I mean, I'm not saying that I'm like a total disciple of Wittgenstein, but I find it endlessly fascinating and go back to it over and over again.
Once a year.
I read that once a year, and I read Kierkegaard's Attack on Christendom, his last, the moment of the writings, every year. Those are my yearly reads.
I view the Tractatus as an example of the dead end that you reach when you take the formalist approach to the limit.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And himself, at the end, he says, "Of that which we cannot speak, we have to be silent," right?
Right.
And I think Torrance is aware of that and is trying to bring more of the latter, the logic. I mean, Torrance's word logic, I think, is much more nuanced than the mathematician's use of logic. So, that we need to change our logic to conform to reality. And that's kind of what I think Wittgenstein's later is doing by looking at the language game, and that what we think we know, like the principle of induction, he says, how do you know it doesn't fall down at infinity or something? So
now here's the thing. So one of the things I comment in my dissertation is that I don't think Torrance fully appreciated the later Wittgenstein. I think that he lumped him in with a lot. There's one moment where he says that surely Wittgenstein is better than his would-be relativistic followers. But I think that he so associated Wittgenstein with the relativistic tendency that I think he was unable to read him carefully. Which is a shame because I think there are certain aspects of what they are doing that are not far from each other. Especially right. And there's another posthumously published book by Wittgenstein called On Certainty, and that I think is closer still to Torrance. That's a remarkable book as well. Oh, I'm certain. But my point though is that in Uncertainty he starts off by saying, if here is one hand. Once if you can prove that to me, I'll grant you everything else. He's poking fun at G.E. Moore. What is realism? Well, I know this hand, I have this hand. And so there's a sense in which you could say the whole book on certainty is that none of us are certain. But what he's really doing is a close examination of what do we mean when we say that we're certain, and how does that play itself out? And it's fascinating to me because there are paragraphs on certainty that make it abundantly clear that at least the Wittgenstein who wrote that was not a radical relativist. He was maybe a kind of relativist, but not in the extreme, Protagorean. Each person is a law unto himself. This is way outside of what we're talking about here. Other than this idea of this interesting focus on actuality.
Well, I want to drop back in through Leslie Newbigin, who wrote the book Proper Confidence, rather than certainty, and to say that when we go into the section, the logic of existence statements, and he uses language like intuitive and an apprehension of the external world, that he's wanting a confidence, that our logic has a confidence that doesn't require certainty, because certainty almost makes the human to be the judge. Right. And the methodologist. And so confidence for Newbigin, in a sense, gives a logic to existence statements that there is an intuitive sense that the other is there, be it God or the world that science is exploring, that one recognizes the external world is there, and then one can reflectively think about that and see patterns of significance, is the language he uses there in 227. The pattern isn't necessarily read in. It's a confidence that one is seeing something that is there and noting it, and then maybe testing it. Is that really there? But it allows the teaching to be done by the other that is there. So it ties in a sense, using the distinction between the word certainty versus confidence, I think, is making the Torrancian move. And Newbigin, I think, articulated that well in that particular book.
I summarized Torrance's realism as basically, in order to have any kind of cataphysic knowledge, you have to have a reality out there, and you have to have some kind of epistemic access to it. It doesn't mean that the access does not have to be infallible, but it does have to be reliable. And so what I mean by that is that we have some way of encountering whatever reality it is. Encounter reality. What a good name for a book. And in doing that, the idea is, so I have my first impression, so to speak, well, then the thing is, I then have to be able to go back and check that first impression, and this idea of, no, I'm never certain. The certainty I have is that the object is what the object is, or the person is who the person is, or God is who God is. That's my certainty. I'm never certain that I've gotten them totally right. And yet, that connection is reliable enough that I can continue to check and continue to revise, continue to restate.
Yeah, which the word confidence, it is, using Mark's word, it is a faith in knowing that what you have engaged, you have a confidence that you've actually met in a way that you can then explore and appropriately reflect upon and know that you're encountering reality, to use the name of a great book that someone could write. So when he goes on page 228 with interrogative operations, the question and answer, there is the questioning of the reality, and the question of how we begin asking the right questions, I guess, is one of my questions, because it is the point at which we are always vulnerable to ask that which is of interest to us. And so I think, as Polanyi says, every scientist chooses the part of science that's interesting to them. And so it is, in a sense, not seeing the whole. It's always seeing a part based on their perspective there. In a sense, we could use the word prejudice as to what's interesting to them, and not in a prejudice kind of prejudice, but it's selecting that deselects. And so when we're doing interrogative operation, how does Torrance envision us really staying true to the nature of allowing the other to speak, to see the patterns that are actually there, and not to have our questions ultimately need to be questioned, which I think is a very Torrancian kind of idea. Yeah. But most people don't want their questions to be questioned, because it's really what's of interest to them. How is this going to work out for me? I mean, that's the contemporary mind is, how's this going to work out for me? What's in it for me? I mean, so if we come to Christianity with the question, what's in it for me? we're going to explain Easter, we're going to explain marriage. Everything is that there's something in it for me. And it's like, I think we got off on the wrong foot. We didn't
Right.
get our initial questions right.
Well, and I think that's Torrance doesn't say it explicitly here, but he does in other places where he says when we talk about our questioning, it needs to be the kind of, he talks about a medieval shift in how we talk about things where we often shifted from questioning as, a student questioning their teacher, who then can come back at them and say, oh, no, you've asked the wrong question or whatever. That there was a shift to saying, well, we're gonna start interrogating. We are going to be the interrogators, and we're going to say we are a judge, and you will answer the question that is put to you, whether that's the right question or not. And I think that so for Torrance, I mean, he has places where he makes this more explicit, but this idea of the questions need to be flexible. They need to be, they're essentially, and then that's the disclosure models that he talks about later on is, here's a complex question that we're putting to reality, and reality gets to say, no, try again. And we never know that we've asked the right questions. But the point is, over time, hopefully, if we're listening, we will realize that some of our questions have led to dead ends and
Yeah.
the rest.
Yeah, and the listening may be important. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Marty. I learned something from George Hunsinger's book, How to Read Karl Barth, and there is a section there on thought experiments. And so this may be related to this.
Yeah.
It's not something that maybe yields the correct answer, but
Right.
it is a thought experiment, and then you question that.
Yeah. Good.
Right.
And I
So
think
this section here,
Bonhoeffer used to the counter logos, that Jesus isn't just the logos, he's the counter logos who questions all of our reasoning. I mean, that's maybe another way of saying what you said there. Go ahead, Travis.
So we have the logic of existence statements, and then the next section is the logic of coherence statements. And what you're talking about with thought experiments, I don't know that Torrance brings it up as such, but it's clearly an issue that's going on here, where a thought experiment allows us to raise the question. So we say what if, and the moment we're doing a thought experiment, we have taken a step back from reality. We have, and Torrance is not opposed to doing that to work out our thinking. There's a place for taking a step back and thinking through the implications of the what if. So you can have a thought experiment, and so basically the idea, the most famous thought experiment in history probably is Einstein, when he was talking about the implications of relativity. He was saying that because gravity is dependent on mass, that mass will bend space and time. And so what ends up happening is, he says, there are some fixed stars that we know where they are, we know where to look for them, and what it means is when the sun is in between us and those stars, it will bend the path of that light, and we will see them in a different place. So the problem is, of course, you can't look at the sun and find that out. So they kept an eye on it, and they waited for there to be a solar eclipse, and they took pictures of the things, and they found out that it was exactly as he said. Now, so at that point, the thought experiment had become a real experiment. But the idea of the thought experiment was to say, well, okay, if this idea, this cluster of ideas is true, what should we expect down the line? And then now the trick then, of course, is so that would be this logic of systematic form, or systemic form. What's it say here? But whatever it was, the coherence side of things, you can work that out, and then you ask the question again, and then you find out if it actually does match up with empirical reality. So there's absolutely a place for thought experiments in the midst of all this. And I want to be clear about that, because I think it's easy, because Torrance is so adamant on the empirical correlates, so adamant about the existence statements, so adamant that we do not remain trapped in our thinking in the abstract. It might be easy to think that he wouldn't approve, but I think he absolutely would, so long as we never think that we can stop there. It always has to be just a way, something we do on the way towards asking the next question.
A society of explorers.
Right.
And your example of the atoms is an example, in a sense, of something where many people couldn't see it, and it required of them to think of it at some level as a thought experiment to be able to ultimately get at what atoms might be. Not that I've ever seen an atom even yet. I wouldn't know one from Adam.
Right. But that's the trick, right? That's the trick. So I mean, and honestly, you look at it, it really is, I mean, what the first notion of an atom in the pre-Socratic world was, little bits of whatever, and then we refined it a bit. Then I felt completely out of favor for a long, long time, and then with Lavoisier and Dalton and that whole crowd, and I should be more precise on my history of chemistry, but then they start being able to isolate specific elements, and they start being able to chemically purify things, and so this idea of you still have kind of this operational idea that it's kind of a lump of something, and so. But then you start to realize, well, hang on, there's positive and there's negative. How does that work? And so it's one of those things where you have these intuitions on what we think a product looks like, and then they devise a way to test it, and they realize over and over again that it doesn't behave like we think it's going to. And I saw a remarkable video the other day, I guess it's a couple weeks ago now, where it was basically showing that light. We talk about light taking the shortest distance. Well, how does light know that it's the shortest distance? And it was a fascinating way they devised to show that light actually takes all the paths at once. And then the interference works out in such a way that which is, I gotta go back and sit with that for a while. But that was a remarkable thing that it's not as if it takes all paths at once and decides on it. It does. It's fast. It was a remarkable physical experiment.
Yeah,
anyway.
that's great. On 230, the idea of the logic of discovery is a little bit different than the logic of trying to capture things in words. So to say that there's a kind of an attitude of discovery, that's part of the heuristic adventure, that would say in the interrogative process, we are operating to not only conclude something, but to find more questions that could be asked. That there is an inherent openness that's willing to discover. And at some level, you didn't even know what questions could be asked until you begun the discovery process.
Right.
And so the idea of every question that gets answered is, if we're really listening, there are probably a spectrum more that are also presented to us in the process.
I don't know if you guys have ever had the opportunity. I mean, it takes some patience. If you actually read Francis Bacon's Novum Organon, his new Organon, where he talks about it's fascinating because it is an amazing case study in being absolutely wrong and yet not necessarily so. Like his facts are all wrong, but he's talking about heat at one point, and he's like, here's a whole list of things that have heat in them, and he's postulating that they've got to have something in common, and he has these different ways he works through them, and they're all bananas by today's standards, and yet you can tell like there's a reason why we talk about Baconian science, and that's so much of what we are doing. Like he's one of the pioneers of what we think of today as science, because he's trying to be systematic. And I think it's important to realize that even if you're asking what in hindsight are ridiculous, stupid questions, if they're genuine questions, if you're genuinely open to hearing the responses, even the worst, dumbest, most ridiculous questions will still, they're not going to be the most effective, but even the worst ones, if they're genuine questions, will actually continue to nudge you towards the truth.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. That's a very encouraging thing.
Yeah. Einstein's statement, I don't make any mistakes. I just have 1,000 steps to a great invention, right? It's a willingness to see that there's something that is being pursued, and none of those steps need to be necessarily seen as bad. They're just part of the process of learning.
It's only a problem it's only a problem if you assume you have to take the most direct path to knowledge, which I don't think we ever have, And that's one of the things fascinating about in philosophy of science is that there's this question about, we talk about the paradigm shifts, right? So this is one of the things, and I wish Carrie Magruder were here to set me straight. But it's like, so you have, Kuhn is paradigm shifts, and people criticize and say, well, it's not as simple as you say, Lars. But the fact of the matter is, there is still we do these demonstrable like shifts in how we approach things. And so the question is, how do you maintain a robust realism on that? And one of the concerns is, well, obviously, as we're making these shifts, we're getting closer to truth. But if you don't probe what that means, now you might say, if all you mean by that is our calculations are getting more precise, well, maybe. But, it's one of those things where we used to think there was ether. Now we think there's not ether. Then we thought there was one. Now we think there isn't one. It goes back and forth. And there are certain things where we're not converging. We're oscillating, on some of these things. It is not intuitively clear when you look at what actually has happened over history that we're necessarily converging on the truth.
Yeah.
And so but the question is that a problem or not? And I think that for Torrance, it's not. And what's one of the things I find so fascinating about Torrance is that he is able to avoid the pitfalls that so many, like so many scientific realist perspectives in a secular perspective that are being developed in these other places. Like that's a problem. If we're not converging on truth, it's a problem for realism, but not for Torrance, because Torrance says it doesn't matter if we take wrong turns as long as we're still coming back to reality. We're still asking those questions. We're still engaging on it. And I think that he is able to, and in fact, what's fascinating about it, sometimes we have this idea of, if we have to throw out our old system, it's because it failed. And I think from Torrance's perspective, it's like, no, it was successful. It was the ultimate success of a theory is to be discarded. It's not that it was wrong. It was that it was right enough to get us to the next level.
Mm.
So I think that some of the stuff that you see in 20th century philosophy of science, I think Torrance is a remarkable navigator of it. And I don't think he realized just how carefully he navigated it that he was.
Yeah. Well, we're discovering all that. I think Carrie might say that something like it's a pilgrimage of contingency. They're unique events, and it's all a pilgrimage. We're seeking, we're moving forward, finding the uniqueness of each part of that journey in a way that you just described, and that's what the history of science is. And he'll be with us for 2 sessions in June. So if you want to be there, you can ask him some of those questions.
Well, some in June, I'll be in Scotland. So,
well, you'll be in June, yeah. Well, I think he may be in Scotland with you for that part of June too. I think he's on the road to Scotland for part of it. So on 231, you say we're moving. He returns to the issue of theological science, meaning he's left what?
He returns to the issue of theological knowledge. I mean, so he was reflecting on. So what I mean is he is drawing our attention back to overtly theological topics.
Okay.
So the reason why I bring that up is because it is easy when talking about logic to assume that because he's overtly, explicitly talking about the logic, human logic. Mm-hmm. And so my point is, even as he's explaining what he means by human logic, he feels like he needs to go back once again and demonstrate, because he's trying to make the point in general that reality is always going to outstrip our language, our conception of it, and almost as if to make his point, in the most extreme form, to say, look, we know that that's okay because we're doing this with God. We've come to understand an interior logic of God, but we know that God absolutely outstrips everything we could ever say or think about God. So, so it's not a problem in theological science. So it's not really a problem in our natural science either.
Yeah.
So I think my point here is to say that once again, we are seeing that Torrance is not musing on logic as an addendum to his theological work. He has brought his reflections on logic. I mean, it is the absolute outgrowth of his theological studies.
Yeah. And your paragraph following, he's returning it. Theological science is capable of more radical objectivity because we are not just objected to by new creation, but by Almighty God who stands in judgment over our statements. So to say the nature of what you would call the modern scientific mind would say, well, I don't think God's, whatever God says, I don't know that God exists. Therefore, whatever God says, I don't know that exists. So the use of the idea of a more radical objectivity, it requires faith-seeking understanding to say, if that is God is speaking, then we have the objective starting point to begin to discover the nature of God. But if you don't have faith, you cannot understand. I mean, is that a fair way of kind of...
I mean, so this idea, with cataphysic knowledge, we know things as they, or we seek to know things as they are. So one of the things that he will say from time to time is, if we're investigating a rock or a tree, there's a certain sense in which, we treat it as an object over which we have some kind of mastery. We can poke and prod and all the rest. When we're dealing with another person, we there's a famous story. What was it? Was it Levi Strauss? Some of that. So one of these anthropologists who went off to another place wrote up a treatment of this tribe that was in all the proper language and all the rest, and the tribe couldn't see themselves in it. They couldn't, he described them in a way that was totally foreign to them. So you could argue that they objected, so they were able as persons to object to that treatment. And so he had to go back and try to find a way to both be faithful to what he knew he had to do from a sociological point of view, but also be faithful to their own recognition of themselves. Because, I mean, Marty, you do counseling, right? I mean, at some point, your description of a person, a couple, they have to be able to see themselves in it at some point,
Yeah.
And you might be as confident as all day as all you can be, and it might be that occasionally, and that's what complicates with persons, is that they may not understand themselves very well either. But the point is, they are able to object to our descriptions in a way that a rock and a tree, a cow can't.
No, that is generally the
point,
case. They don't see themselves. Yeah. I actually had someone recently who I just said, I just want to see the best you come out. And she thought I had an idea of what her best self was instead of a kind of physics. I want to explore with you what that person is, because I hear all the fear and everything that constrains you to not be that. So it required that clarifying conversation that we're merely in a discovery process, and nothing is predetermining what that looks like, other than that we're going to ask the questions and figure out what is it that you being not encumbered by the fears of showing up in your relationships looks like. So
what I expect that at least once in your career, you've had an assessment of, a person or a couple that was wrong, and you had to figure it out again. I mean, just because, just the law of averages.
Yeah, assessment is a tricky word, but we won't go into all of that.
Okay, I'm not trying to get into your wheelhouse here.
No. It's the methodology I use is a Torrancean style of methodology. It's purely investigative and having them investigate so that they see it. So I don't have to be the judge. I just have to make it evident to them what might be happening for them to discover. So anyway, that is the hope of Torrancean studies for the therapeutic world.
So the point, though, of all this is that, just as a human person at least has a different kind of objectivity because they can object to being objectivized, God all the more so. That God, God is the one who is who God is, and none of our wishful thinking will change that. And God can and does routinely stand against our formulations.
And the fallen position of humanity is our objecting to God's objection, right? I mean, it's the tragedy of sin is that we just we can't see the other for who they are. If you don't see God as the one who created us, loves us, then you will object to your wrong view, which Ray Anderson said he would stand with people and shout, I want to get rid of that God too.
Right.
So that we can get to the real God, right? So to stand with people and object to the God that they think has been, causing ill in their life and all that. Getting rid of that is part of the demythologizing process, right?
Right. And I'm not trying to just constantly say, hey, you should read my book. But one of the things I do in a chapter on objectivity is talk about that we often think about objectivity of how can I be objective? And with Torrance, the question is, how can we allow reality to be objective to us? How do we get ourselves out of the way, so to speak? Which seems like linguistics laid a hand, but it's not.
Yeah. So that's page 232. The self-disclosure of God is that objectivity of God, which moves to 233. God is love, what you describe as a case study of God is love on your handout. And I appreciate that there is a case study because it begins to ask, how is Torrance looking at the nature of language in ways that we can then apply? So it's doing the very thing that's the non-Euclidean mode of investigation. 234 continues this. Is there anything that you'd like to just say about the nature of what this case study really revealed for you?
So he makes one of the things I think is fascinating, and I think it's just important to notice it right here was he's nervous about people taking statements and making them timeless. That God is love, and there's a sense in which you could say it is timeless because God always is who God is, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God is eternally. I mean, our knowing of that content is not based on a timeless. It's based on a revelation in the fullness of time. And so I think that he's trying to take us through this idea, which once again is this rooting and grounding of when we say God is love, he is saying, okay, we are not speculating here. We are not coming up with where we've heard of love before. We are looking at the actual revelation of God in Christ. Again, relentlessly concrete. At one point he refers to Jesus as the concrete universal. And I think that it demonstrates his rigorous commitment to the Christocentrism and a posteriori investigation and cataphysic knowledge and all those things.
Right. And then on 235, just living within that kata physics process. On 235, in the second place, the forms which we reach in this way through question and answer require to be tested for their relevance to reality. So that's kind of what you keep talking about. Reality has to be the objective, developed in
Right.
their correspondence with each other. So this is that second move of the analogical operations going on. So we're taking our language and we're working it together. That is to say, existence statements have to be analyzed to see whether they are what Frege called recognition statements. So is there a particular weightedness to that phrase that is brought by, because recognition is a word we use, but it sounds like
Right.
there's something that could easily be missed with that, objectively derived oriented. Anyway, so I want to make sure we get the point of trying to.
I only really know Frege by reputation, so I haven't dived deeply into his thing. But even that footnote here, he says, my use of recognition statements would, however, be more realist than Frege's. So my reading of how Torrance is using the term is this idea of we said something about the external reality. Did we just invent it? Are we imposing it on reality, or is this a statement that we're making in response to something we have recognized that we have encountered?
Right. Okay. So yeah. So again, McMurray talks about we act in the world and then we reflect on that, and that becomes the reflective activities of humanity, which he describes as science, art, and religion, which Torrance would call theology. So in a sense, the recognition there is we have acted in the concrete world, therefore we can reflect on it, and we're not just done there. We go back and act again in light of what the reflection was, and we are testing at some level the reality of what is there, which Torrance might say that's the life of prayer at some level. It's the engagement with the reality of the other who's there. So he also on this page talks about the chains of referential relation. And so that is the word chain there is just things that are being shaped into constellations of thoughts that refer to each other in a sense. Is that right? That there's the intuitive sense of who God is, that there's something about Father, Son, Spirit, where the Son has a body, the Father and the Spirit don't. And yet personhood somehow has a chain of referential relation that the words begin to be informed. So we know the Father through the Son. Even though we haven't physically seen the Son, there is something that's happening in the filling out of the human logic about the givenness of God in the person of Jesus.
Right. So this, I think, is a crucially important part for him, right? So he says, so recall that existence statements occur in meaningful connections or chains of referential relation. Otherwise, they're blind. Hence, it's not the reference of singular statements, but a whole pattern of statements that we have to investigate, thus determining their ontological as well as their analogical import. So what that is a very synthetic comment from Torrance, that against a rigorous saying that. So there's a need to break down our concepts and look at them on a one-to-one level, but we also do to step back and look through the whole disclosure model. He talks about as being lenses later in his writings, and I think it's important to realize that that we are not necessarily, we're not uncaring, but we're not only obsessed with the ontological referent of any particular statement. We are concerned with how a system as a whole relates to reality. So, for example, we make all kinds of comments about who Jesus or who God is that we cannot draw an explicit external experiential revelation, content, right? So we can't point to any one moment in our lives, and so we can go back to some of our experiences and find how they are covertly Trinitarian, but none of us have overt, explicit Trinitarian anything, which makes sense because people so frequently miss the Trinitarian nature. If it was obvious and overt and explicit, we wouldn't have that problem, but we do. Now my point is to say, what that means is many of our Trinitarian comments are not necessarily overtly, directly, explicitly experienceable in themselves, but they are part of a system that is experienceable. And so part of this is kind of one of those questions where I love this marvelous moment early in Barth's Dogmatics where he says, dogmatics is not saying what the prophets and apostles said. It's what we have to say on the basis of what the apostles and prophets said. And this idea of the Trinity is an answer to a question that is raised by the encounter with Jesus. At the end of the day, if you reject the Trinity out of hand, then there's going to be a lot of things about Jesus that just won't make sense. And so it's one of those things where it is an absolutely implied conclusion, but it's not something like none of us had an over. Like I'm trying to make sure I'm not coming off as weirdly anti-Trinitarian, because I'm not anti-Trinitarian, by any means. But this idea of, I don't know that I've had any experience that, I have lots of experience I can point and say, oh, I can see how the triune God was involved there. But I don't have. It's like Gregory Nazianzen, right? There's three candles. I can't tell the difference in the light. So my point, though, is maybe there's a more mundane example we could use there, but this idea of not every statement about stuff is experienced. Also, or here, natural science, right? Standard model of quantum theory. For ages and ages, they had hypothesized the existence of the Higgs boson, right? And up until that point, nobody experienced it for a long, long, long time. And then suddenly we finally got within, 6 sigma, confidence that we had, experienced it. So it's one of those things where up until that point, though, it was literally not experienceable. And yet it was the necessary result of the system. If somehow we could conclusively prove that there was no such thing, no such particle that acted the way it did, it would mean we'd have to at least ask a different series of questions. But that's the point. It's not every statement, not every, piece of the puzzle is going to have an overtly external reference. But some of them are going to have to. And the system as a whole is going to have to. So we're asking questions not just on a micro level, but also on a macro level.
Right. Which you're calling synthetic. It's the holding it all together.
Right. So there's a role for the analysis of saying, which of these statements really do have an external reference. So for example, the empty tomb is one, right? And so if there were no empirical correlates, what he'll say later in his career, then we had to seriously question a system that has no empirical correlates. And yet the empirical correlates are only part of the picture. That the reality of the resurrection is not reducible to the fact that the tomb is empty. It is the empty tomb is vitally important, but it's not exhaustive of the meaning.
Mm-hmm. So he goes on to talk about analogies, the whole analogic, that the analog is that from which the analogy is based, and then the analogy is that which is the derivative of it in the human sphere. So he's building it's the same point of, it's grounded in God. We can appropriately use analogic language if it's properly grounded in God, and then make statements from it they don't have value in and of themselves. They are merely derivative. I bow my knee before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth derives its name. So the nature of the derivative part is part of the logic that he's wanting to keep in place. Then on page 239, he goes on to paradigmatic. It must be emphasized that the component forms of this conceptual pattern are paradigmatic in character. So do you want to talk about how he's using the word paradigmatic on page 239?
No, just I feel like I'm rusty.
Okay.
He talks about the paradigmata, right? He clearly uses them as like archetypes in a way. That this idea of who is it? As forms contingent upon their objective realities, they direct our minds to apprehend them and provide us with some means, however slender, holding them in the grasp of our apprehension, yet without giving us any conceptual control over those realities, since as forms they're open and limited at the same time. So, what that's saying to me is that the reality that we're trying to understand kind of impresses itself, or we allow it to impress itself upon our thinking, and that doesn't mean that that we're always right, but it means that our statements need to still be tethered to that which gave rise to them, so that they can be challenged. I think that's the work that it's doing there. He does have a footnote saying paradigmatic is here used in the patristic, not in the Platonic, Aristotelian, or Kantian senses of the term.
So it's your kindness that leads us to repentance. So we live in a world where our mind is being transformed by the nature of the God revealed in person of Jesus, and it's a whole picture paradigmatic shift in a Kuhnian sense, that we're seeing the world differently because of what, or rather who, has been revealed to us. So there's a contingency on this person of what we call objectivity. Jesus is the objectivity who shifts our paradigm to a sun shift into a new way of seeing the world that's not a me focused paradigm or even us humans, but it is truly directing our minds to live and think out of the renewal that comes in knowing the person of Christ. So he goes on then on page 40, 41. He's got an A, B, C, and D that are walking through. Well, he opens, we may draw together this discussion of the analogical character of existence statements in several paragraphs. So do you have a
and
sense
so
of
either I didn't have anything else to say about that, or I ran out of steam. Probably a combination of both.
I just want to make
generally
sure.
find when I write these things just in general, I see a
Yes.
pattern, and that is like the first 2 pages, I write and write and write and write and write, and by the time I get to the end, I'm like, he's saying the same stuff, and I just kind of give up.
Mm.
Which is
Okay.
probably why I've not been a successful academic.
Who said you weren't a successful academic?
From a classical perspective of what constitutes a successful academic, I don't think I quite qualify, which is fine. I've come to terms with it.
So
I
that's
have
from
peace.
some mechanical model that would say that our metaphysic investigation of you is that we find to be quite satisfactory, if not enlightening. So
I haven't published anything since 2019.
So yeah, published is only one measure of the contribution of a person.
Okay.
You show
Okay.
up every week and you help us to see through here. So I would call that the success of somebody who both engages the world of pastoral ministry, still is conversant with those who are trying to understand and make sense of all of this in helpful ways. So in my mind, you're successful. And I think
Well, thank
others would feel the same as well. So the nature of open systems is particularly the point too, that there's something of the past and the future, that we are both in relation to the past, but there's a future to be discovered that's part of this process. So it's not either just being diving into the past, jumping over Lessing's ditch, but it is that we see the past and we recognize that there is a discoverable future because we go with the one who created and sustains it. So scientific theology at some level is going into a future because the living God is in that future. And we are going with that living God in a process of discovery. And our statements, I think, are supposed to help us to, form questions, what now? Who are you in the settings we find ourselves? Who are you as one who wants to redeem and restore people who aren't interested in you? So the existence statements at some level, I think, they are attuning to what you said of Karl Barth, that we say what was said then, that's the past, and then we keep asking, what are you saying now? And that is an evident part of what theological science does, is staying engaged in the empirical context in which we find ourselves and to listen to what it is that God is doing in those particular places.
I mean, this shows up in my day job as well. Like one of the recurring themes that I say, which I don't think I'm unique. I don't think I've invented this idea here. But one of the things you'll hear me say for the whole bit frequently is you got to go back to Jesus, back to Jesus, back to Jesus, back to Scripture, back to Scripture, back to Scripture. And it's like, yes, you might think I am totally certain of what God has said to me in this situation. Great, fantastic. Go back to Jesus anyway. Because if you're right, great. But if you're wrong, you need to go back and test it, and so much harm has been done by people when they assume they already know what they don't already know. And I will often, remind people that sometimes God says, like, go north, and you start heading out north. And if you stop listening to God, you'll just keep going north, and you miss the fact that at some point God wants you to go east. Like God wants you to go north to a certain point and then stop, but you didn't listen, so you didn't know. And so it's that reminder of just always having that tether, to God, to Christ, and never assuming even the things that you're so sure of. Well, if you're so sure of them, go back and check them again.
Yeah. So the end of theological science is not just doctrinal statements or things that we preach. It is literally the living of a life day by day that knows that you are not alone, that he's promised to be with you and guides you, and by the Spirit to hear, go here, see that person, touch that person, be expressions of my love that become the fruit of the Spirit that aren't because of us. It's just simply that we're following where theological science leads us into the personal life of the one who transforms us.
Mhm.
On 244, the first full paragraph begins, how does all this apply to theology and especially to the organic forms of dogmatic instruction? In much the same way, it must be said as to other sciences, if we remember the scientific requirement at all times to conform to the nature of the object. Indeed, the kind of analogic we have been discussing is particularly relevant to theological existence statements, for in them, as we have seen, we are concerned with correspondence with the word and act of God. That's what I just heard you saying about your work. So that the correspondences of their referential relations to one another are or should be clearly rooted in the correspondence between the divine acts of communication. But because referential relations remain utterly contingent, dependent upon him, their analogical patterns direct us back to a divine source infinitely transcendent over them. And so, I mean, that's a more complicated way of saying what you were just saying and what Bart says, back to Jesus, back to scripture.
Right.
So then he has these two statements vertically at the bottom of 244 and horizontally at the top of 245. So can you assess what is the point of the vertical and the horizontal?
I guess I stopped taking notes at this point. So let me go back and.
I know. I'm putting you on the spot.
So what it's doing is, so essentially, I think what he's making here is the same distinction that he was making earlier in the chapter, and that is we're talking about existence statements versus coherent statements. Vertically, this idea of our statements do need to go back. So vertically, the analogia fide, to use the theological expression, operates in such a way that we refer everything to God and nothing to ourselves. That this idea we have that external relationship, and then horizontally, this applies no less to compound existence statements, or what we may call dogmatic formulations, where the organizing of referential relations into analogous patterns must make it clear its own limitations through self-correcting operations. So it's this idea of this. Vertically, we need to make sure our systems are open. Horizontally, we need to make sure that they are consistent. And Beautiful. The goal ultimately is that our consistence will eventually begin to look more and more like the actual consistence of reality.
Awesome. That was a wonderful wrap up. I think the section that says that there are clear things that we can walk away with that are repeated, but there is something of seeing them all in a single statement is quite good. Good. Well, and we're going to have you back next week and the week after.
The week after. You guys are going to be so sick of me. It's crazy.
It is. We are having so much fun. Next time, we're going to bring popcorn. And
there you go. People were showing off their copies of Theological Science, so I got to show off my early edition. Yep.
It's a first edition hard copy of T.F. Torrance.
It's one of my few Torrance books that I have not actually printed up. I often actually don't even use this copy of it. I have scanned it and I use my digital copy that I take notes in.
Can you see young Els holding up there?
Yes.
Brothers of a different mother. Yes.
I scanned mine too.
Right. I don't want to destroy this book. Are you kidding?
I wanted to have it immediately accessible when I don't know where this is. But yes. I got this at the used bookstore and it's great. I have the paperback edition, but it was falling apart. So this is my, nice.
Are you saying you have a PDF of Theological Science?
That I scanned myself, yes.
Yeah, so the question is, would you be willing to share that PDF scan?
Sure.
I don't have an electronic form, and for the purpose of doing searches, it would be really helpful. So anyway,
it's PDF. It's scanned. It doesn't necessarily have optical character recognition on mine. Anyway.
That's right. It does not, and it's pretty big. It's like 600 megabytes. So,
you scanned at a higher resolution than I did.
Yes, I did. I did it at the maximum that I could, in case I wanted to, digitize it, but it's not working.
There's a searchable edition online at archive.org.
Okay.
You can search, but you cannot read. In other words, you can bring up the word like I did today. I forget what I was searching for, it'll give you that, and you can actually copy the context of surrounding that word to
Okay.
some extent. But
That's good.
I don't have that, but over the course of my studies, I've taken so many notes and done so many transcriptions of passages that I basically have it in various fragments that I can
I
search.
use Google Lens, and I can quickly copy 2 pages. Well, it took me about 20 minutes to copy today's assignment or today's section.
Reading.
And I've got most of the book, but
that's what I did when I had all these digital copies of it. And so when I was reading through them before moving over to St. Andrews, every time there would be a theme that would come up again, I would essentially tag it in my notes. And then I exported all of my annotations, and I could search through. And so compiling footnotes was fairly straightforward, because I could say, on this topic, C, ding, 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 down the line.
Very good.
And Elmer Collier said, I did the same thing, but with note cards. And I said, it's not the same thing, because you can't search note cards.
I like what Torrance said at the end there. With all this talk of statements, ultimately, God is more to be adored than expressed.
Mm-hmm.
And
Bottom
you're good
line,
at putting out those rich statements there, Bill. Appreciate that.
Sorry, what?
I said you're good at bringing out those rich statements, and I appreciate that.
Yeah. There's one more below that where ultimately what does matter is Christ himself.
Mm-hmm.
Truly divine and truly human, and as one incarnate person. Bottom line, that's it for him, and hopefully for all of us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you all for being here, and Travis, especially for your wonderful outlines and your engagement. Your enthusiasm is worth the price of admission alone. So
that's right. It's free.
Right.
We get not only content but also a sense of why it's worth having a passion for this, because we see it in you, and so that you bring it to your life of ministry is just it's all the more rich to recognize this is not abstract systems. This is engagement with reality. So
that's right.
Did you make a decision? Did you make a decision, Travis, on your selection of books for your students? What were you looking for? A book on
Well, I was looking for a short, pithy summary of the issues of natural theology in Torrance. And I got all excited because I'd forgotten I had Alice McGrath's biography. And one of the ways I like to crawl inside texts is to kind of read them aloud, and I made them record at the same time. And I got about halfway through, and I said, I'm not assigning this to my students. So my hope is that Elmer's book on how to read T.F. Torrance, that section will be approachable enough to get the job across. We'll see. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Well, blessings on you all. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Marty.
You bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis.